SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The discussion so far has been on the socio-technical system and its impact on the technical aspect of an organization's activity. I would like to move it forward to cover the social aspects, because the socio-technical systems clearly has an equal impact and interface with the social dimension. Talking of social dimension is more easily said than done, and it requires a bit of effort to understand it, because the pervasiveness of the social systems covers various aspects of social sciences, which include sociology, anthropology, history, psychology, even political science. Now, it may not be necessary for you to have an appreciation of all these basic disciplines, but in terms of working of organizations, it is essential for you to appreciate that these disciplines do leave an impact on the decision making process. So, typically the historical experience manifests itself through the heritage variable in any organization, the traditions of an organization, the established technological flows of the organization, because at any point of decision making there are a set of givens. The whole ethos is captured under longitudinal thinking. Similarly, there are issues of ethnic overtones, gender overtones, of culturization, and that carries its own weight in decision making systems and organizations, and that would be the subject matter of sociology. If you stretch certain components of it, it becomes a subject matter of social anthropology. Not to forget political science, because political science is the study of the struggle for the control of the decision making process. All organizations have their struggle for the control of the decision making processes, and there is a whole disciplinary specialization labeled political science, which studies the architecture of this dynamics. The examples can be many, but within the limitations of the time which we have, I would like to focus on certain critical aspects of decision making, which you may find of use to understand the socio-technical systems component. And we can begin our analysis by looking at the psychological dimensions. The impact on psychological dimensions of the technical subsystems is large. Traditionally, the assumption was adaptation, but it affects the network of social relations among the workers, size and composition of the working groups in range, character and frequency of contact with fellow workers and supervisors, lead to job insecurities, status position of the workers, physical and social mobility, the outmoded jobs, self-image and motivation, and the list goes on. Only a naive person would assume that these do not affect decision making. Yet, a person who is statistically oriented, who is used to handling inanimate processes, non-live materials, can be at sea in trying to understand what is the network of social relationship amongst workers. And remember, the word worker here is not the blue collared man, but anyone who works in an organization. In fact, it has been found that network of social relationships establishes a definite influence on the decision making patterns, and since all decision making roles have a range of possibilities, the tilting is very often in the direction of the pressure of the networks of social relationships. In fact, the truth is very often under the pressure of social relationships, the decision making goes outside the bond. The size and composition of the work groups in range are also determined by the psychological dimension, because there are groups of people who are comfortable working with each other, and there are people who simply cannot work with each other. And this is a psychological dimension of the technical subsystems, which cannot be ignored if you want to make sense of operating the technical subsystem. Then the character, frequency of contact with fellow workers and supervisors is a definite factor in the speed and efficacy of decision making. Indeed, very often tools of organizational regulations, processes can be used to make life uncomfortable for people whom you do not like, which leads to job insecurities. And it is not as if all decision making tools, all decision making situations are handled with total degree of impersonality. That would never happen. So, the psychological dimension of the socio-technical systems is a very important component to keep in mind if you want to understand the impact of the socio-technical systems approach on decision making styles and decision making situations, and assess it for a scientific critique and a scientific operation. The status and position of the worker is an important criteria if you keep in mind the fact that people working in the organization need not necessarily be the people who have ownership of the organization, because by and large when it comes to ownership issues, ownership is seen to be vested in those who have invested their money. The physical and the social mobility is a factor. You find people with similar regional backgrounds, similar social backgrounds, creating groups, cliques, factions in an organization, and certainly together they will have a tendency to perpetuate outmoded jobs or declare perfectly relevant jobs outmoded by importing certain kind of machinery which would render them redundant. Not to forget what is put here right at the conclusion of the listing: self-image and motivation. We all have our self-images. In fact, the truth is most of our self-images are extremely flattering. If you want an illustration of how flattering our self-image is, look at your own behavior each morning when you look at the mirror. You keep staring at the mirror repeatedly and running your comb through the hair endlessly till the mirror gets finally tired and says, yes, you are looking grand and you can get out into the world. It is another matter that you may be nowhere near looking grand, but you have to convince yourself that you are looking grand. So, self-image is the determinant of much of human behavior. Thereafter comes motivation, and that is a psychological dimension. In fact, later on in the elaboration, I am going to talk to you for 2 hours if need be on the need to understand motivation and how it affects actual managerial decision making or actual managerial situations. But to carry this discussion of the social dimension of socio-technical systems, I would like to take you away from the self-image and motivation concept to the impact it makes on the psychosocial systems. And here you will find psychology and sociology coming together in the understanding of the operational aspect of an organization. The truth is, increased specialization resulted in greater predictability of work behavior and increased discipline in the workplace, because the actual tasks being discharged, being carried out in a technical frame creates certain type of a behavior. Those who are interested in linguistics will also realize that certain types of professions speak in a certain manner. The IT specialist speaks in a certain manner. The textile man speaks in another manner. And the illustrations can be large, but we do not want to get into all that here. All that we are saying is greater predictability of work behavior leads to increased discipline in the workplace, because there is tremendous structuring of behavior through the technological processes which is operated. Assembly line affects the social organization in terms of size, in terms of the interaction of the work groups, in terms of interpersonal relationships and many others. In fact, it creates a scalar division in the organization. It is rooted in wage structure and in promotional aspects. The boss on the assembly line may very often be a supervisor, and the supervisor is not always a management person. Similarly, alienation and dissatisfaction in assembly line workers and more motivation, integration and satisfaction in craft and continuous processes workers is well established according to some thinkers. In an assembly line situation, there is tremendous boredom, because the tasks are repetitive. It leads to alienation and dissatisfaction. But when it comes to craft and continuous processes, there is some variety in the job, and that leads to greater motivation. Therefore, all that is being suggested is the character of the task helps formulate a psychosocial system. In fact, emotional stress, which is what I am talking here, emotional stress, lack of group identity often leads to loss of productivity. One of the greatest deterrents of performance is stress. Stress is always a mental phenomena. Stress is always the value you attribute to a situation. Stress is always something which will happen when you have a level of discomfort with what is happening. Also, stress need not be necessarily a personality factor within the emotional ups and downs of a person. It can also be caused by elements such as lack of group identity, because it is well recognized in social sciences that preservation of identity is as basic to the operation of social sciences as the conservation of mass is to physical sciences. Be that as it may, for the moment one needs to understand that the way a technical subsystem is organized will create its own impact on the individual personality. So, if the technical systems can have this kind of an impact on psychological systems, then clearly the demands of management will require identification of remedial measures. The identification of the remedial measures would require documentation of time tested managerial practices, which can eliminate the negative features which I have been describing to you through the 2 or 3 slides which have been projected in this segment of the presentation. Let me list it for you. Increased production can be an instrument of higher level of satisfaction, and therefore, the level of achievement motivation could go up. Also, experiences of personal satisfaction in terms of receiving appreciation, in terms of a job well done in your role, especially when it has to do with a situation where you believe you are underutilized. Instead of getting frustrated in it, personal satisfaction will come if there is peer level appreciation for the quality of the task which you produce, which leads us to the third kind of a remedial measure, where technical subsystems could have a positive impact on the social being of the individual when there is quality and efficiency. Much of this is a derivation of personal satisfaction, or in operational terms even increased production. The summation will be the maintenance of high levels of group morale. If the morale is high, difficult tasks are done efficiently and with speed. But if the morale is not high, then it is difficult to create a positive self image of people. Better coordination always leads to better results, but that has to be enabled not just technically, but in terms of the human factor also. And one of the best remedial measures is job enrichment. Your tasks are added to, the level of your task allocation is raised, and in operational terms you get to see a situation which is both a recognition of your talent and a larger contribution to the production process. This leads to increased organizational effectiveness and efficiency. I will sum it up in a slide and show it to you as a conclusion of what I have just said. You take a look at it for a few moments. Now, together the psychological and the technical subsystems, the social and the technical subsystems will create an impact on the managerial system. Here is a listing of the ways in which it would create an impact on the managerial system. Special skills and training could combine the social system and the technical system to impact managerial system. The impact on staff and functional personnel, middle and lower level managers would improve if there was specialized skills and training. The role of first line managers required to integrate activities across broader spectrum would undergo enrichment and therefore, would be extremely useful in understanding socio-technical system. Supervisory requirements, both in terms of technical and human relations, would have increased. And finally, traditional systems where primary consideration has been to give differentiation or segmentation to activities into subsystems for tasks performance would be improved for the better. Be that as it may, it is important for us to recognize that the focus all along is on improving managerial systems for better results. And the socio-technical systems approach is an approach which moves on two wheels to enable this a little more easily and a little more powerfully. To continue with the impact on the managerial system, in a traditional systems, primary consideration was given to differentiation and activities of the subsystem, but in a complex system, this increased differentiation resulted in integration problems at various subsystems. This is a view which Burns and Stocker have propagated, but let us try to understand what is being said here. If you have a traditional system, then there is greater pressure to protect boundaries. If you have a traditional system, then there is a greater need to emphasize differentiation, to highlight your own significance. But as the traditional system grows complex, as would be the case in large scale industrial complex systems, differentiation will give way to integration, because the requirements of coordination and focus and finding a fulcrum for action would be so large that differentiation will lead to atomization of managerial action and a situation where people may not be necessarily carrying out their tasks in sync and in coordination. Mechanistic approach works well in a stable system, where rigid organization structures start emerging and they start resembling bureaucracy. Well defined tasks and the methods, duties and powers of each functional role will be determined precisely, but the relationship of this role with other roles will be a definite variable in the job design. Coordination and interaction with vertical command hierarchy will be not an autonomous function in a given system, but will have to work in tandem. A situation where one's command at a vertical level would have to be consistent with the command with another vertical level. which is why I have explained to you that in a traditional system, the primary consideration was given to a differentiation of activities in subsystems, and I have explained to you with reference to Stoker. But then I want to take this forward and draw your attention to the opposite of a technical system, a mechanistic system, that is the organismic system. The organismic system would be adapted to rapidly changing technology and environment. The organismic system would be in very many ways different to what I have just explained to you as the mechanistic system. The basic difference between the mechanistic system and the organismic system, as it is being explained to you here, is that in organismic system, decisions in one vertical will be also taken with reference to the systemic consistency which it would have with decisions in another vertical. Typically, your managerial style of communication will be in its own segment correlated to the managerial style of the control segment of the organization. Your communication patterns will be systemically consistent with your control patterns. It is not as if you are controlling with high degree of rigidity, but you are communicating with a high degree of openness. It will not work. If you are controlling with a high degree of rigidity, then communication will also have to be carried out in a controlled manner. Therefore, the organic system or the organismic system, both words are used interchangeably, adapt to rapidly changing technology and environment. It is suitable to unstable conditions. In fact, in the present state of affairs, all conditions are unstable. There is instability with reference to price. If the price of petrol can escalate 3 times in a month, that it will not be very long before the frequency would be such that almost ever so often within a week, you will find your budget being impacted by a simple announcement which takes place with such frequency that you do not know where to adjust it in. That is an unstable condition. There are social instabilities, there are financial instabilities, there are regulatory instabilities, and you name it. So, unstable conditions are the only stable factors to contend with running an organization. Now, that is a debate which I do not wish to enter, but that there is no debate in realizing that the element of unstable conditions around an organization have hugely increased in the last few years. Therefore, in effect you will need flexible structures. The flexible structures would require continuous adjustments and redefining of individual tasks through interaction. Now, this business of continuous adjustment and redefining of individual tasks through interaction would cause a setting up of a network. The key words in this statement are adjustment and redefining of individual tasks, which is the characteristic of an organic system. Lateral communication, wide dispersal of power based on technical expertise and knowledge will take place. You need to pause here to recognize that after having studied structure, processes, design and their working in an organization, Elements of communication and power could alter the boundaries of structures, could impact the nature of processes, and the operational design of an organization may be very different from the design of work which is there on paper. Try to register that statement clearly. The operational design of work of an organization, because of lateral communication, dispersal of power and other factors, may turn out to be widely different from the design of work which is there on paper. If that is so, then the study of the impact of managerial intervention, the choice of managerial styles, and the way a situation is handled will have to become a surrogate of continuous ability of the manager to observe, map, interpret and then decide. Remember, the 3 steps are observe, map, interpret and then decide. The authority and supervisory knowledge do not necessarily coincide. This is a very important factor. Authority and supervisory knowledge, which is vested in the superior, if they do not overlap, then what would be the result? The result would be people with authority do not have the superior knowledge, or vice versa. People with superior knowledge do not have the authority. A perfect case for organizational dissonance. Therefore, there may be insecurity on the part of managers who are in a superior position, but do not have superior knowledge. Innovative judgment and decision making where stress is on problem solving, and we would create a bureaucratic jungle. This diagram, like the one before its diagram, in this presentation on socio-technical systems, you will recall there was a similar diagram presented in the preceding presentation. Let me take you back to it. You remember this diagram? Goals, values, technical systems, structural subsystems. We go back to the diagram now, which I am showing you. You can see that there is much repetition. Why is this so? It is so because it is to remind you that organizational systems remain constant, and it is the impact of the socio-technical system on the organizational system that is the subject matter of our analysis. So, this is the domain area which will be taking the impact of socio-technical systems. That is the purpose. What are the structural subsystems? Structural subsystems, as you see projected before you, are established pattern of relationships amongst the components or parts of an organization that are relatively stable and that change slowly. They create the structural subsystem. In fact, the structural subsystem is inferred from the actual operations and behavior of the organization. Arrangements of its subsystems and components in 3 dimensions space at a given moment of time determine the direction of the movement of the structural subsystems activities. Structure and its functions are separate phenomena, but cannot be looked at as completely separated. Now, if structures and functions are separate phenomena, and yet get integrated, then its impact on the organizational system is going to be large. Initially, all this was set forth by the design of the major components or subsystems, and then by the set patterns of relationship amongst these subsystems. Internal differentiation and pattern of relationships, with some degree of permanency referred to as the structure. Structural subsystem therefore can have formal and informal structures. Formal structures are designated structures. Formal structures are the ones which exist on paper and therefore have the annotation of authority and command. But informal systems are the ones which really decide how an organization works, and there again the networking system becomes the determining factor of the direction of decision making. Very often the structures that are formal may be slow in responding to external changes, such as technological changes, and it is the informal relationships which propel this relationship. The informal relationships propelling changes in technological factor shows that there can be a synergistic rhythm between the formal and the informal structures. The defining characteristic of the informal structures is that it is adaptive and serves to perform innovative functions. How is it adaptive? It is adjusted to the social dynamics of the players amongst themselves, and when that happens, innovation can take place, because innovation requires the will to release the energy to move the system in a manner which is not the traditional patterned manner. Therefore, traditionally concentration was on formal organization structures, and informal relationships were looked upon with some question mark. Times changed and both got enmeshed. In the era that we live in today, malleable structures are much appreciated. Even if they are not totally malleable, certain degree of resilience is a very useful managerial perspective, and the socio-technical system helps to establish that. Sometimes it is difficult to understand the nature of formal organizations without investigating the networks of informal relationships, because directions may be given to a decision making which are not really supported by the formal organization, but to understand it you get an informal relationship. The interplay of political forces and their positioning very often helps to explain this, because political statements even within organizations are made at times not so much with reference to reality, but with reference to the expectations of the outcome of a decision. The unofficial norms as well as the formal hierarchy of authority and the official body of rules therefore work together. The unofficial norms may prevail because they say this is an informal organization and we do not codify these patterns. In fact, the argument has now been carried over to a point where it is said that good organizations are practice driven. They need not necessarily be rule driven as codified. Now, I do not want to take a position on that debate, but what you do have to realize is the nature of organization studies is an evolving one, and what was fashionable at one stage of analysis need not be fashionable at another stage of analysis. Therefore, the unofficial norms as well as the formal hierarchy of authority and the official body of rules may coexist, and there may be a situation where a blind eye or a Nelson's eye may have to be turned to an operational aberration. Therefore, the perceived cleavage between the two, the formal and the informal, in this day and age has become artificial. Two basic models therefore are operating today, the bureaucratic and the matrix. I have shown to you earlier on while discussing the design of an organization both bureaucratic and matrix, and just in case you do not remember it, let me recall to your attention the three levels of pyramids which I displayed to show to you the visual illustration of a pyramidal structure, and what you should be recognizing is that that is the heart of a bureaucratic system. Then again, if you recall the last diagram which I showed to you of organization design, it had collegial form of structure in some divisions, pentagonal form of structure in some divisions, a pyramidal form of structure in some divisions of the organization, and they were all coordinated through link pins of one division overlapping with the link pin of another division, and the end product was a mixed matrix. Now, that is how real life operates. The impact of socio-cultural environment has also been studied typically by Stinchcomb, who decided that structure at the strategic level has a great impact on the forces in the task environment. That was the result of his findings, that structure at the strategic level has great impact on the forces in the task environment. In fact, multinational companies strongly influenced by differing cultures in which it operates and has to adapt its goals and structures and managerial approach to different cultures, is a good example of how structure at a strategic level has great impact on the forces of the task environment, and vice versa. Even multinational companies have to make allowances for what is happening at the local level. The impact of the socio-cultural environment was highlighted by Chandler. He maintained that changing population, income, technology and other forces, let me repeat that for you, changing population, income, technology and other forces in the environment led to expansion of these firms into new fields. The strategy of diversification and expansion led to major modifications in structure. In other words, strategy and structure are correlated. A theme which has been ploughed several times, and Chandler is an outstanding name in that field, the field of strategy and structure, and the point which he is making is the strategy of diversification and expansion can have a huge impact on the structure. Central corporate office plans now not for the whole organization, but for purposes of coordinating the multi-divisional structures. The activities of a number of operating divisions also have to be coordinated, and the corporate office has to allocate personnel, facilities and funds for other resources. Operations are decentralized to the operating divisions which have a substantial degree of autonomy. Now, here again is a very important dimension which needs to be kept in mind. It is not only the structure which varies, it is not only the processes which need not be identical across the board, but indeed the quality of autonomy which may exist from one decentralized unit to another decentralized unit may be at variance. So, ultimately one ends up in a situation where there is a structure of conglomerates, small corporate headquarters emerge, they do not exercise strict control or coordinate activities of the operating units, and subunits are self-contained and autonomous. This is the larger point to take home. Integration is achieved through corporate divisional interactions with minimum division to division integration. Please note this very carefully. Integration is achieved through corporate divisional interactions with minimum division to division integration. The basic strategy is to integrate at the strategic level. This means you integrate at the top and you let the units operate amongst themselves. The impact of technology, size and complexity of the organization are the variables to look at and are the elements to understand. So, back again to the basics, and here again one shows the managerial subsystem of goal setting, planning, assessment, resources, organization, implementation, the goal values and subsystems, the psychological subsystems, the technical subsystems and the structural subsystems. Why did I bring this diagram back to your attention? The diagram is brought back to your attention to show that there can be considerable autonomy on all these dimensions at the subunit level, and yet the streaming and flowing of the decision making styles may be meeting at the convergent level to create consistency of command and policy operation. So, the scalar principle is being carried to its logical process, and you are expected to understand that it is not just the overall internal consistency which matters, but from one level of the organization to another level of the organization, there can be variances of patterns, and those variances of patterns will show itself in a acceptable mix of autonomy and unified control depending upon which level needs autonomy and which level needs to be integrated at a policy level. So, the elaboration highlights the social aspect of the socio-technical dimension of analysis which we are currently concerned with, and has run through various levels of social dynamics to explain how managerial system is impacted.